Let me ask you something. When CARICOM leaders talk about Cuba, and they talk about Cuba constantly, what words do they use? Comrade, solidarity, brotherhood, resistance, courage. They talk about Cuban doctors, Cuban schools, Cuban sacrifice, Cuba standing up to America. What they never talk about, or what they seem constitutionally unable to talk about, is what Cuba actually is. A one-party state where political dissent is a criminal offense, where journalists are imprisoned, where religious freedom doesn't exist, where the people who built the very schools that our regional leaders praise have no right to vote for the government that rules them, where personal exercise of faith could land you in prison. What I want to do today is go further than that, because the Caribbean's Cuba problem isn't just about Cuba. It's about what Cuba did here, specifically what it did in Jamaica, and what that cost us, what it still costs us. And let's be fair to the romance first, because it was real. In 1972, Michael Manley won the Jamaican general election in a wave of genuine popular hope. He was charismatic, educated, Jamaica College and the London School of Economics. He was a trade unionist, he was handsome, he was a son of political royalty, Norman Manley, one of the founding fathers of modern Jamaica. He carried a rod he called the Rod of Correction, which he claimed Joshua gave him in Ethiopia. People believed in him. In 1974, his party formally declared itself Democratic Socialist. And in July 1975, Manley flew to Havana. When he stepped off the plane and embraced Fidel Castro, it wasn't just a diplomatic visit, it was a statement. Jamaica was choosing a third path. Not American capitalism, not Soviet communism, but something independent, egalitarian, Caribbean, or so we were told. In October 1977, Manley presented Castro with the Order of Jamaica, the country's highest civilian honor, for Cuba's contributions to Jamaican schools, sports facilities, and infrastructure. The most famous of those contributions was the Jose Marti School in Twickenham Park, St. Catherine, a full secondary school built by Cuban construction brigades, the Brigadistas, and handed over to the Jamaican government in 1976. Manley himself acknowledged it was controversial. He stood at the handover ceremony and said, "This school has been one of the most controversial events in recent local political history." He asked why such a good gift was made to seem sinister. It's a fair question. And the answer is because it was sinister. Not entirely, not simply, but enough. Here's what the solidarity narrative leaves out. The word brigadistas in Jamaica in the 1970s carried a deliberate double meaning. Publicly, construction workers, vocational trainees, young people learning skills. That was the story Cuba and the PNP told, or wanted told. But Jamaica's own security establishment told a different story. According to contemporaneous analysis, drawing on Jamaican government and intelligence sources publicly available, the PNP under Manley built two parallel security forces alongside the regular police and Jamaica Defense Force. The first was the Jamaican Home Guard, a new force comprised of PNP supporters. The second was the Brigadistas, described not as construction workers, but as a communist guerrilla-type brigade, trained in Cuba, loyal to the PNP, and built up to the point where the combined Home Guard and Brigadistas were nearly as powerful as the country's legitimate security forces. Jamaica's own Minister of National Security would later state in formal proceedings that special cells linked in ideological solidarity have been put up to commit acts throughout the entire country, the effects of which are seen in various types of crimes which would not ordinarily be recognized as political: bank robberies, hold-ups, house breakings, murders, shootings, and there was the arms question. A shipment of what appeared to be ammunition from Cuba arrived in Jamaica, consigned through a Cuban state company operating on the island, managed by a Cuban national, paid by the Cuban government. The opposition JLP, led by Edward Seaga, accused Manley of running down the legitimate security forces to clear the field for these party-loyal paramilitaries. These are not JLP talking points. Criticism of the JLP will be coming shortly. These are findings from Jamaica's own Minister of National Security, documented in international human rights databases. Cuba's gifts had two faces. We were only shown one. I want to tell you about a man named John Hearne. Hearne was a Jamaican novelist, one of the finest writers this country has ever produced. He was a close personal friend of Michael Manley, a democratic socialist by his own description, a self-proclaimed democratic socialist. He had been in the PNP since the post-war period. He worked at Jamaica House, the official residence of the Prime Minister. Mr. Hearne and Mr. Manley were brothers in a political cause. And then Hearne broke with Manley publicly, painfully, in 1977. What broke him was not Cuba. It was a fire on Orange Street in West Kingston in May 1976, a tenement where poor Jamaicans lived. PNP supporters were quietly moved out in the days before. The JLP supporters and everybody who remained were burned in. 10 people dead, 500 homeless. Hearne went to Trenchtown and other communities in Kingston and saw what was happening. The PNP systematically displacing poor people to achieve political advantage. A strategy its own operatives called in patois, scatter them. Political cleansing. Hearne wrote about it in the Gleaner. What happened next tells you everything about what Jamaica had become. Demonstrators from the Workers' Liberation League, the PNP's Marxist-Leninist ally, paraded outside the Creative Arts Center, UWI, where Hearne directed. Graffiti appeared across Kingston. John Hearne is a British CIA. One placard read, "Hearne must burn," and then he was beaten. At the PNP's own party conference in 1977, a group attacked him, accused him of writing dirty articles in the Gleaner. The police had to fire shots into the air to save him. A decorated Jamaican intellectual, a democratic socialist, a friend of the Prime Minister, beaten at a party conference for telling the truth in a newspaper column. And he was not alone. Wilmot Mutty Perkins, one of the great Jamaican journalists of the 20th century, wrote for the Gleaner throughout this period alongside Hearne, Maurice Cargill, and David da Costa. These were the journalists the Gleaner's editor Hector Winter assembled to hold the government to account. Perkins paid for it. He was fired. He lost his job. Political operatives tried to destroy his family's economic livelihood. In his own words, political thugs would ride past his home in a relay shouting threats he said he could not repeat in a family newspaper. This is what happens when a government romanticizes the Cuban regime and socialism. When it imports not just schools and the doctors, but the logic and the ideology that dissent is betrayal, that critics are imperialist agents, that the cause justifies the silence it demands. Jamaica did not become Cuba, thankfully, but it tasted what Cuba tasted, and it spat it out, barely, in the 1980 election at a cost of at least 844 lives. I want you to understand what that cost built. The garrison communities of Kingston St. Catherine, Montego Bay, broader Jamaica. The dons, the political gangs, the fiefdoms of Tivoli Gardens and Arnett Gardens and flankers, they did not emerge from nowhere. They were constructed deliberately by both political parties as instruments of power. Houses were allocated on patronage. Communities were made loyal through coercion. Gunmen were armed to secure votes. By the late 1970s, political garrison communities had been established throughout Kingston, St. Andrew, and St. Catherine. The running battles between PNP and JLP passes in the 1980 election campaign displaced nearly 20,000 people from their homes. That architecture, communities locked in tribal loyalty to political parties in exchange for protection and patronage, is still the architecture of Jamaican inner city life today. We're not talking about ancient history. We're talking about the living inheritance of an experiment that was seduced by a Soviet-style, by a Latin American, Cuban-style political ideology, socialism, and paid for in blood and broken institutions. And yet, CARICOM leaders every year reliably condemn the Cuban embargo. They mourn Cuban hardship. They speak of Caribbean brotherhood. They do not mention what that brotherhood cost Jamaica. They do not mention John Hearn beaten at a party conference. They do not mention the 844 dead. They do not mention the 20,000 burned out of their homes. They do not mention that some of those construction workers, those brigadistas, came back trained for something other than construction. I'm not arguing that the American embargo on Cuba is just or unjust. I've written about Arab imperialism, Chinese imperialism, Iranian and American imperialism, and I'll continue to write about it. I am arguing that moral clarity requires us to hold two things at once. That American foreign policy can be heavy-handed or wrong, and that Cuba's government is a dictatorship that has exported its authoritarian logic to countries that were foolish enough to welcome it. I am arguing that the Caribbean's solidarity reflex, the instinct to close ranks against the North, against the West, to romanticize revolutionary governments, whether that be in China or the former Soviet Union or in Cuba, because they stand up to Washington, has cost us dearly. Not in the abstract, in bodies, in garrisons, in the institutional rot that Jamaica is still trying to dig itself out of, in the decimating of our middle class. Thousands of persons that fled because of the bloodshed of the 70s and 80s. We're still trying to recover. The poverty that it has cost us, the loss of our culture, our people, our identity. John Hearn understood this. He lost a friendship. He was beaten for it. He kept writing. The least we can do is tell the story honestly. I'm Francesca Tavares. These are my views, and I believe Jamaica and the Caribbean is strong enough to hear the truth about its own history. Let's think. Let's read. Let's write. Let's step out of our ideological echo chambers. We don't owe any political party loyalty. Stay tuned.